Hello and welcome back to Zilog and Moto, where I have the goal of going through every English language release for the Master System, Genesis Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X, and maybe a few non-English releases. We'll see. But every does mean every, not just the ones you've heard of, like Shinobi, Toe Jam and Earl, Sonic, etc. It also means some that are pretty obscure. And unless you're a collector or really old, or both, then you may not have heard of them. And this goes for United States releases too. I'm not just referring to stuff that only appeared in Brazil or Europe that the average Yank definitely wouldn't know about. Also, reviewing every game means not just reviewing the games I want to play. I like beat 'em ups and shooters, so of course I'm going to want to give stuff like DJ Boy or Gyra's a try. However, a turn-based strategy game from Koei, the company responsible for the Romance of Three Kingdoms series, not exactly at the top of my must-play list. Oh, but wait, there's more. Turns out this week's game, Aerobiz, is not a historical warfare sim. Oh, no. It's an airline business simulator, part of their executive series. Oh yeah, sign me up. I don't see enough emails on a daily basis for work. I need to look at some bar charts and PLL statements in my free time. So, let me pause for a sec. First off, no, I'm not making any of this up. Erebus, seen here, is a very real title, and the executive series is an actual thing. However, only the Erebus series made it to the United States, with the other titles in the series remaining in Japan. And yes, you did hear me correctly, I did say Erebus series, as this is a franchise, and we'll be looking at the sequel to Erebus, Erebus Supersonic, in about 100 episodes or so. There was also a second sequel/remake released for the Saturn and PlayStation called Air Management 96, but like the other titles in the executive series, this remained in Japan only. As you can imagine, Erebus and Erebus Supersonic are not the most common Genesis games in the world, with complete copies of both titles going in the $80 to $130 range. I had seen Erebus locally in resale shops, but never complete and never Erebus Supersonic at all. So that price range seems to make sense just due to the rarity aspect. Due to the recent unfortunate cancellation of this year's Midwest Gaming Convention, I also chose to purchase some titles from eBay to fill out the collection, or at least that's the excuse I'm going with at this time, I think. And with Erebus being near the beginning of my list, titled alphabetically, I figured it was time to finally make the plunge, even if I didn't necessarily want it as much as certain other titles. Well, yesterday my copy of Erebus arrived, and looking at the last 58 episodes of Zilog and Moto, I figured it would be good to actually get a bit of variety in here and go ahead and look at it now, rather than getting to it when, who knows when, just because I know if I put it on the shelf, it probably will sit up there until I really start to run out of other titles to look at. And then a miracle happened. Unrelated to Zilog and Moto, I actually still play modern platform games. I just started playing Yakuza 0 to begin that series, great game by the way, and I wanted to get back into that. But I also knew that being a turn-based strategy game, I wasn't going to be able to just jump into Erebus, as it's a little dense. So I told myself, okay, it's 9 p.m., let me mess around with Erebus for an hour, and I'll still have some Yakuza time before I go to bed. 5 hours later, it is almost 2 a.m., and I'm forcing myself to save and go to bed, never having picked up my Xbox controller. So, what happened? Well, we'll get to that. But first, let's take a look at the package. And this is Aerobiz. Pretty unique cover with all the baby blue background. The logo, it could use some work, but I do like the O in the middle being part of the plane. Also, and this is a real small detail that may not be able to be picked up on camera, but if you look very closely at the horizon in the artwork, you can see landmarks from the various cities around the world, representing the fact that literally part of the game is trying to link 22 major cities from all over together with airplane traffic. Also, I like the tagline down below, "As CEO, you call the shots." Gives the game some nice energy, which might otherwise be unfairly stereotyped as just a boring sim. The case itself is in great shape. It's a little scratched up in places, and there's a small nick on the spine, but otherwise it's fully intact with no rips and tears. And as a nice bonus, the hang tab is intact at the top. And honestly, it better be in great shape because I technically bought 2 copies of this game due to purchasing it and then later on getting a steal of a deal on a package that included both this title and its sequel, so I kept the better looking copy of everything. Having said that, the inner cover on this copy is specifically better looking as there's no damage to any of the edges and there's no sun bleaching to any of the colors, whereas the other copy you could tell had been left out a little bit as the colors had started to fade. Flipping over to the back, and you can immediately see a drawback to having the bulk of the cover be baby blue, with a large percentage of the in-game content being a similar blue color. And it makes the screenshots a little bit harder to look at, but at very least, they've added that yellow border around them. Also, I probably would have chosen a different picture than the first one. I know they included it because it's the main screen you see when you're playing the game, but it's a little hard to make out everything on that screen when you're playing the game, much less when it's squeezed into a tiny box on the back cover. Other than the screenshots, the rest of the back is pretty straightforward, and I appreciate the flavor text using a slightly larger font than we see sometimes. But then they try to get cute and have the plane from the logo miniaturized and angled to serve as a bullet point, and you have to look at really close to see what it is. But one important point that you shouldn't miss, and that we'll talk about later, is that the game is 1 to 4 players. Opening the box up, and we've got a decent looking cartridge that features battery backup, thankfully, and then a manual, and a poster that features the cover art. And here it's easier to see those landmarks, including the different countries that I mentioned earlier, so that's nice. And last but not least, the manual. Now this is a manual. No 3 pieces of paper stapled together and folded like we saw with Clacks last week. Oh no, this is 64 pages of instruction book. It does have a bend on the spine, unfortunately, but I kept this copy of the manual rather than the other one, and that was because the other one had some unfortunate graffiti on the cover. This manual is great and is essential to getting everything possible out of the game. You can try playing the game without reading the manual, and you might even be successful, but it's going to be an order of magnitude harder to do so. And there's probably some screens of the game that you won't even realize exist without reading them, due to how they're accessed. I'm not going to lie, there is a lot of text and content to digest in this manual, but I also think that's normal, and there's certain sections, like the aircraft guide and the charts toward the end, that are designed to be used over and over for reference purposes. Okay, well that's what it looks like on the outside. Let's get to how it plays on the inside. Aerobiz, as the name indicates, is a turn-based strategy game based around the business of the airline industry. When I started to play Aerobiz, it immediately made me think of all the adult board games that have made a renaissance in the last few years. I'm not sure how well Erebus would translate to a physical version, as I'm sure there would have to be some alterations made, and there are a lot of stats that the computer calculates and keeps up with, but it just feels like an idea that would make for a good board game. Doing some quick Google searching, it does seem like there's a few board games out there, but nothing that really emulates Erebus. So what is it about Erebus that makes it special? Well, first off, as mentioned before, Erebus is a game for 1 to 4 human players, but you can also choose to have 0 human players, and just watch the computer simulate a game amongst itself to get a better idea for how a playthrough will go. However, this certainly isn't necessary, and if you've ever played a strategy game before, you're probably better off just jumping in and trying to figure it out for yourself, as after a few turns, it will become pretty obvious what types of things you need to do and accomplish during a turn to keep up with your opponents, and hopefully assert your dominance. To aid in your attempts to play and figure out the nuances of the game, Erebus offers 5 difficulty levels ranging from beginner to pro. I'm not exactly sure what changing the difficulty level changes about how the computer players act, or just how precise you have to be with setting prices, choosing planes, etc. But I do know one aspect that changing the difficulty level affects directly is one of the 3 winning conditions, which is how many passengers your airline ferries around the globe, with a higher difficulty requiring more passengers to fly on your planes to win.
This also brings up an interesting side note, in that you can technically beat the game without having the best performing airline. This may only occur in the easier difficulties, and in full disclosure, I did play the game in beginner mode this past week to get a feel for the game quickly, to aid in getting this review done in a week. But having said all that, in the first game that I finished, my airline technically was getting hammered towards the end, and was solidly in second place amongst the computer opponents. How did I manage to win the game? Well, winning consists of three things: being profitable at the end of the calendar year, so that the annual report shows your airline is in the black, so to speak; having flights connecting all 22 cities included in the game in some fashion; and the aforementioned passenger threshold based on difficulty level. So while technically my airline was only second in earnings and passengers toward the end, I was the first airline to connect the world, which allowed me to win. And this is where the strategy part of the game really comes in. Now granted, I don't want to try to make certain aspects of the game seem more important than others, but it does illustrate the concept that winning the game isn't just about how can I make the most money, and I like that. If I wanted to just buy property and sell property all day, I could just very easily play Monopoly. But Aerobiz includes so much more, like trying to decide how geographically you're going to expand your airline in a manner to where you can be profitable. Maybe one of the competing airlines is already strong in a certain area of the globe. Are you going to go right at them and compete on similar routes that will feature lots of passengers? Or are you going to try to create unique routes in that area to avoid direct competition and make more money, but potentially have a smaller pool of passengers to attract? One thing that I think is nice about how the game is presented is if there's a route that's competed on between players, at the end of each turn the computer will present any changes to the passenger numbers between the different airlines. And I always found it very satisfying when my airline would either retain or take the lead from another airline. And if I fell behind, the competitive juices would start flowing, and the first thing I would immediately do on the next turn would be to take a look at that specific route and see what I could do to better compete. There were many times when I would go into that route and drop my ticket price by just $1 less than the competitor in an effort to better compete, but really just to give that airline and the computer a virtual middle finger. And here's where the depth and customizability of the game really comes in. Prices can be adjusted up and down on flights in single dollar amounts if you like, and you can choose to lose money on flights if you want to try to attract passengers on a specific route. Also, you can choose just how many flights you're going to put on a route if you've bought the necessary slots from the airports in question, and what types of airplanes you're going to use to potentially either board more passengers or lower costs by using more fuel-efficient aircraft. Have a route that's not performing up to snuff? Either cut flights on it or drop it altogether and instead allocate planes to a better performing route to bump up profits. It's all up to you. Now, you may think, based on everything I've described so far, hey, I don't know about this game, it seems pretty complicated. And that was my exact thinking as I put the cartridge in the Genesis for the first time. It's certainly not Sonic the Hedgehog, I will give you that. But it's also not quite as complicated as you might think. Yes, there's a definite significant learning curve, and you're not going to be able to just pick up the controller and be good at the game with no experience, unless perhaps you've played other Koei strategy games and know a bit what to expect. And this was actually something that I was pretty apprehensive about, as I do try to play all the games for Zilog and Moto around 8 to 10 hours per game before writing the review. But I was worried that 10 hours might not be enough, given the intricacies of the game. And to that point, to get really good at the game, more than likely you'll be spending way more time than that, due to how long turns last, and the addiction that comes from just wanting to play one more turn. I can definitely say that even though Erebus does have a significant level of complexity, once you make it past the initial "what the hell do I do now" stage, playing the game becomes second nature. Again, similar to an adult board game, where the biggest problem usually is learning what the flow of a turn looks like, and once that's down, it's smooth sailing. One thing I haven't talked about yet, and it's something that I very much like about the game, serving to further suck you in, is the historical accuracy of the game. Erebus features two distinct eras of gameplay, either the dawn of the Jet Age from 1963 to 1995, Or you can choose to start in 1983 and go into what was the future at the time, running until 2015. I didn't mention this earlier, but the reason why each age is 32 years is because the game has a maximum of 128 turns, with each turn representing 3 months of a year. And if the computer doesn't win in 128 turns, well, everyone loses. The importance of the timeline in each of the two scenarios is twofold. The first is that, well, certain airplanes simply didn't exist in 1963. You can't just start out an early era game buying 747s because Boeing hadn't started producing them yet. However, they and other more advanced aircraft start to appear as you proceed through the game, adding more wrinkles to the game like, should you invest money on newer aircraft that are potentially more fuel efficient, or should you just try to keep your old birds running as long as you can? Also, not only do newer planes appear, but older models cease production as time goes by. And, to add to the realism factor, I wasn't just being flippant referring to the 747 by name. The game features real plane models from Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, Airbus, and others. In an era when racing games didn't feature real cars and sports games didn't feature real teams, this is a huge plus for me, and shows how serious Koei took development of the game. The second aspect of importance of timelines to the game is that certain historical elements are represented in the game. For instance, when playing the 1983 to 2015 scenario, almost immediately you are hit with the start of the Mideast War between Iran and Iraq, causing fuel prices to go up, and potentially causing issues with routes in the area. But these historical elements aren't limited to the bad things. There's also things like the Olympics and the World's Fair mentioned in the game, with routes involving those locations becoming more in demand and profitable temporarily. Now, sometimes when I play a game, I just want to be off in Fantasyland and be distracted from the real world entirely. But when things like this are done right, I really appreciate the attention to detail. As you can imagine, with this being a strategy game, there's less importance in the game on graphics, sound, and control, 3 things that usually weigh in very heavily on a game from this era. To sum up, the controls in the game are simple, with the controller used primarily to select options and boxes on the screen to make choices, and this functions well. The sound, while not a major factor in the game, is probably pretty underrated. All of the in-game sound effects are good, such as cheering and planes taking off, and the game features multiple background music tracks, with each of the 22 cities having its own theme song that represents its area in the world. None of it's the best music I've ever heard, but it's also not bad, and the sheer variety again shows the effort put into the game, as the audio aspect was definitely something Koei could have been very lazy about. As far as the graphics are concerned, you'll get used to seeing many of the same screens over and over again, and it's a lot of static images. But like with the music, the art is well done, and none of it looks bad. It's certainly not the best looking Genesis game, but I've seen far, far worse, and that's simply not the focus of the game. However, as an added bonus, the game does have a very nice animated intro and a nice animated ending sequence for when you beat the game, just adding some nice touches. Overall, in a rating that I was completely not expecting to give when I purchased this game last week and decided to slot it in for a review, I'm giving Erebus 3 stars, with the caveat that I understand that strategy games are not for everyone. However, if you do enjoy strategy games or have an affinity for aviation, I think this has to be on your list of games to play. With as pleasantly surprised as I was by Aerobiz, I'm actually very curious if its sequel Aerobiz Supersonic will garner an extra star from me, or if it'll just be more of the same. I guess we'll find out in 100 episodes.
Okay, that was Erebus. And I must say, it's games like this that really made me glad to do this channel and collect these titles. Had I not been on this mission of collecting and playing all these games, I probably never would have purchased Erebus, much less played it. And I would have missed out on a very fun, addicting experience. While there's lots of games out there like Clax, the subject of the previous episode, that don't really move the needle, so to speak, being able to play these other titles that are more meaningful and then to tell you all about them afterwards is a real blessing, and I'm glad I get to do it each and every week here on this channel. Tune in next week when I play another relatively new arrival to the collection for the Sega CD from another genre that we haven't touched on so far on Zilog and Moto. I'm actually a pretty big fan of this genre, having played a lot of these types of games on the PC, where they're more prevalent than on home consoles. However, I've never played this specific game before, either on PC or the Sega CD, so I'm definitely looking forward to experiencing this one for the first time. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.